In this video, I would like to be able to place an enemy agent into the space. So currently, the primitives that we can create into a space come from the UI. So this is in TypeScript, where we have a list of things we can place into the scene. And all of these primitives are just strings, special strings that we recognize. And this will create an entity. And we can take a look at our migrations. So we have the space, and spaces have many entities, and the entity is just an ID with a name and a type. So that primitive string, that gets stored in a type. So when it's brought back out using the serialize function and put into JSON, JavaScript land, we look at the type, and then the scene manager will create the proper type in this loop. It's I think it's find or create mesh. This thing will say, well, what was the type? If it's a box, then we'll use the mesh builder create box. And Babylon.js has a lot of nice primitives. It's called the mesh builder that can create all kinds of different things. There are some that it doesn't have for example, the gun, which is a combination of a couple of primitives, which I've put together at the right angle and colored it. And yes, so these are how we create things. And I think the the GraphQL also allows us to create these things, right? So we can create an entity, and it takes a type and a space, and I think this just places it at the origin. So if you look at the create entity resolver, gets a space, and then it creates the commit entity, and this will just, it just places it straight at the origin, no option. So we might, how do we want to be able to put a monster into this space? Well, we should have an event to allow us to do that. The current types of events are right here. So I think we added a new one, agent placed, agent path planned, agent removed. Or we could use entity created with a different kind of type. But I sort of feel like the entity created may be too generic. Maybe we should have different creation functions specifically, like this agent one. Enemy created. Let's start off simple. Comment these out. So this is who's placing it. It has an agent ID, has a position and a rotation. Or you can just use entity created. Let's start with entity created, maybe. Let's go to event names. Remove these for now. we jump into entity created. Entity created takes any kind of string. So if it's just not supported, it won't do anything. And you can call it an entity. It'll be stored in the graph. And so these will still be supported. You can transform it, move it, delete it, maybe grab it. Some of these will optionally be supported based on the tags. Well, let's start that way. We have this API. Let's see how far we can take it. So, entity created. Sure. So the prims could have an entity called the enemy. And we'll give it a shape. Didn't we have an enemy for a primitive for a spawn point? Maybe we should create that too. To do it, create a visual mesh representation of a spawn point. Add to primitive menu. Alright, coming back here, we have enemy. And so that's going to create an entity. It's just going to work. Our GraphQL will also just work. Going to place it there. Now we need to draw it. So if we come to the scene manager, find and create mesh. If it's an enemy, let's draw a box there. Else, if entity type is enemy, let's do this. So mesh equals on mesh builder, create box, entity name, this scene. Let's make it out of a couple boxes. So let's, instead of this, we'll make this the head. And we'll make this smaller. So the head size can be maybe half a meter big or even smaller, like that. And we'll say to get head. And then maybe body. Let body equal another box and make this, let's see, the height can be 1 meter, the width can be half a meter, and then the depth can be maybe 25 quarter of a meter. And then we'll so this whole thing is positioned where? This whole thing is merged. So I think we do want to put that at the origin. If we look at the prims, this one is set a little bit high. If prim is grid, else if friend is enemy. Let's put that on the ground. Let's say components. Position is equal to 0, 0, 0. And that's fine. Coming back to the scene manager. Let's move the head of this to be about 1.5 meters tall. And let's move the body position Y to be maybe 1 meter tall. And then we'll add a transform, I think, and put both of these in there. So let a transform equal on dot transform node. Look at the documentation here. New Babylon transform node root needs a name. I guess so. This can be the entity name. And we'll call this entity name head and entity name body. So maybe we'll put this at the top and assign these as children. So head set parent is transform, and body set parent to the transform as well. And then mesh equal transform. Okay, so this is not a mesh. So here's where it kind of breaks down. Everything else here was a mesh. This is something you want to operate as a transform. So maybe it does break down. Maybe these are not mesh type of entities. These are meshes. So maybe we don't do this here. Okay. So we're doing find or create a mesh. Who calls find or create mesh? It's in the parse initial scene. Okay, so those are meshes, but then we want to do maybe load your enemies. So if we create it, it's an entity, all right, but this one, as it took this entity, this is going to return nothing, right? If we go find or create mesh for the entity that it doesn't find anything for, this will just be abstract mesh. So it would get created and it would get parsed as things that you can color. So I think I need some more granularity in handling these entities. Some things you can color and some things you can't color and move. Which means disambiguate meshes from enemies to other settings. These occur globally. Things you render in the scene that you can move around. Maybe the lights would be different too. Lights spawn points behave slightly differently. Meshes are meshes. You can color them. Color, scale, move. Lights you don't really color. Move, you don't scale them. Spawn points, you move. Enemies, you place. And setting, you really just have fog. Maybe background music. But if everything is an entity, even these things are entities. except maybe settings, because entities you can have many of the same kind, and they're in a graph. I don't know if it's important that they're in a graph, because, well, it might be. At least meshes like spawn points probably can be in the graph. So if these are the high-level points, meshes, maybe meshes are the primitives, and things you draw that don't have primitives, like a ribbon, for example. Those can all be meshes that you can color and manipulate. But then you have things that are baked. So you have nav mesh. Then you might have sounds. And sounds, you have nav mesh. You have other meshes. You also might have a combined mesh. Like you have all the mesh definitions when you're editing, but then you have combined meshes. Combined mesh, and then you have interactive meshes, or what do you call? You have GLB files. Which is what, geometry? What do you call that? Mesh file data. This might have animations, it might have textures. I don't know what to call it. This could be external. External asset. Could just be asset. Then sounds are assets too, right? Sounds are images. Maybe we don't do images yet. So either way, we load this stuff through the types, and then our storage mechanism can change based on the snapshot. So anywhere we want to put things, we can put things. And I think it's more powerful if you don't just have a generic create entity kind of thing, because then you have to give a whole list of components, and these things are less type checked. So I think it might be better if you didn't have this entity created thing. You have ribbon created, spawn point created. That's very specific to the thing to help you, and then the requirements for what data it has is much more strict and applicable. I think it makes for a better API than to jam so much into this generic entity created thing. I think transformed is fine if it supports transforming, scale. Coloring, if it applies, it may not. Delete, grabbing it, releasing it. Okay, so where am I? I originally started off wanting to place a monster, and I started getting lazy and wanting to put it into entity, but I do think it deserves its own type. So I'm going to come back. I said we were going to start small, but we're going to place monster into the scene. And I think this is probably fine. Agent placed. Maybe it's an enemy. Enemy placed. The enemy might want to have a type as well. We could say, here's who placed it. I don't know that we'll have an ID though, because we're not involving with the crowd agent yet. So it might just need a kind of UUID. Enemy UID. Enemy name. And then the puzz rut. Maybe enemy type. So here's where I think that doing this without coupling it to the UI frees us and really just focuses on the API rather than trying to put it into the primitives business here. In fact, I think this whole thing might need to be redone. So let's do API first, development. randomly placed. And I think we should have something like spawn point created, box created, cone created, sphere created, plane created, column, what is it called? Cylinder created. There's a gun created. Rather than creating guns that have two kinds of logic, what if you just locked people out of editing it, and then you created gun spawners or ammo spawners, and they would only spawn in after a certain amount of time. Then your entity or whatever is the monster spawner, enemy spawner. And it has some logic where it will just create some monsters. Just like a spawn point created. Member enter, member left, member move, member observe. Change mic preference, change the nickname, member was damaged. Spawn, so these are kind of like in-game play. Spawn point created, box created. You create a monster spawner. If you're around, if the leader is around, it will spawn a monster. If the leader's not there, it won't spawn a monster. And then anybody new in the space can load the monsters up from maybe a gen server. And the leader's providing messages anyway. So you don't actually create any monsters in the space. The monsters are created at runtime by the leader. Any guns that you create, maybe you want to create with the gun spawner, so when one person picks it up, the interactables are created with spawners. At least those that you can pick up and throw and then dispose of. There are other things like maybe create a switch or door created. So if you create primitives, it's not locked down, somebody comes in and they're interacting with it. They can grab it and move it. This isn't something that's spawned. They grab it and move it, and you kind of want to like keep it there, at least for a moment. And if they dispose of it, you create a new one. So interactables. That you have multiple people getting to play with it should be spawned. But what if it's like a crank thing? Then maybe only one person can interact with it. If it's a switch, like these have all been about editing the space mostly. Some of them are now mixed up into the play. Like this. There hasn't been any logic here to create other things. How do we create a Doom style game? We need guns. Actually, okay, so you need an enemy. And a gun to kill the enemy. That's all you need, right? You jump in, grab the gun, shoot the enemy. Wouldn't be very exciting. But you can, so when you're creating this space, step 1, create the space. So you'll say enemy created. Maybe you need a floor, so you go kind of like a floor created with some parameters, 10 by 20. A wall created at, height, length, whatever. Maybe a couple of those. Then door created, key created, enemy created. Gun created. That's your level. Okay, then step 2. Well, first you got to go into edit mode. I'm not sure that's an event. Is that an event? Maybe it is. Then refresh. Refresh or edit mode exited. The enemy is moving, so we should get some of these messages, right? Otherwise, it would randomly do a thing and we wouldn't have any history for that. So enemy moved to, enemy moved to, and also member moved to. I think we still track what this is. We get member moved to. Yeah, this is useful for playing back the creation of a space. Then you come over to enemy, you're playing the space, or at least you're not in edit mode. Even in here, I guess the enemy might just be randomly walking around, maybe just not attacking you. It's still awkward, isn't it? You're editing while somebody's playing it. It's very awkward. What about step 3? Return to edit. So you edit mode entered. Then enemy maybe when you're in edit mode, the AI agents just stop. That's super annoying. Then you can move or transform entity. Entity transformed. This is the gun grabbed, triggered, enemy killed. How will you know if the goal is reached? When all enemies are dead? Or you at a goal that is, you have to get to a certain space. You have to be able to point and shoot something. You can also create ammo. Created. What happens if somebody enters late? Oh, here. Step 2.5. Second player enters. All the guns are taken. All the ammo is taken. So that's not nice. Somebody could give it to them or wait for next spawn of gun spawner, ammo spawner, enemy spawner. And that'll keep him entertained, because even if he comes in, if he waits long enough and survives long enough, there'll be a new wave of guns and ammos. And then abandon guns, ammo. Well, it will only spawn if he doesn't have it. It won't just spawn it for no reason. But maybe the leader does that. So then we don't create static enemies, we create enemy spawner, gun spawner created, ammo spawner created, health spawner created. Okay, so I feel like our objectives here are create a full-fledged event API for one, designing a Doom game, a spaceship bridge game, two, create event API for playing said game, three, create snapshot, create event handler to snapshot to parse events needed to persist the game, and load it. So create database schema to persist the game. These two kind of go hand in hand. And then five, create the JavaScript engine to load the game and be able to emit runtime events to broadcast. So this sort of redesign is the crux of where we're at. The current infrastructure of what we have is insufficient because we've got entities and that's really all we have. And I feel like we need a better API to load lights, to load sounds, to load all these kind of different things. Let's take a break here.